Welcome to Bay Area Psychology. Tonight we turn our attention to patient-therapist sexual contact, a relationship romanticized in movies such as Mr. Jones and The Prince of Tides. In reality, this is a devastating phenomenon. In the 1991 Frontline documentary on the Richter Henry case, there was a survey quoted which reported that 9 out of 10 patients who have become sexually involved with their therapist will experience negative effects, such as depression, panic attacks, sexual disorders, and post-traumatic stress. 11% will require hospitalization, and 1% will commit suicide. Therapists often defend their conduct, saying that the therapeutic relationship has ended. Let's take a look.
The decision to get involved with Melissa on a personal basis, were you then acting as her therapist?
You know, she called me on the 21st or so and said she wouldn't continue with me as a patient, and if I cared about her as a person, I would have some sort of friendship and some relationship with her. And at the point I agreed to that, I stopped relating to her as her physician.
I said to him, I just want to know one thing. If I wasn't your patient, could there have been something between us? And he said yes. And I said, well, if I tell you that I'm not your patient, can there be something between us? Now, he was still my doctor when I asked this. And he said yes.
Tonight, we are fortunate to have Richard Ferry, a marriage and family child counselor, who is returning to us at Bay Area Psychology to discuss this painful relationship and its consequences. I want to thank you for joining us to talk about this topic. This is not a common area of specialty or interest. In fact, often therapists are uneasy about even talking about this particular topic. So I appreciate your willingness to come and delve into this kind of painful situation.
Thank you.
Now, in looking at the clip we began with, that was a reference to the justification that once I'm no longer your treating therapist, it would be okay for me to have a sexual relationship with you. What's your feedback about that, and what is the actual guideline for therapists about that?
That's one of the 3 rationalizations that offending therapists use to justify this behavior, and that is essentially saying that the sexual contact is outside of and irrespective of the therapy relationship, or it's after the therapy relationship. Same thing. The courts have found in civil cases that the therapy relationship is pervasive. It extends into many parts of the patient's life, and that claim is totally specious. It simply is a foolish, silly, sleazy claim to make.
Okay.
And that has been found through the 70s and the 80s.
Okay. What are the other 2, just out of curiosity?
The other 2 are, the one is that the sexual involvement is part of the therapy. This is in order to help the patient feel better about her sexuality, feel better about having been recently divorced. There's several very creative rationalizations that offending therapists have used in self-report inventories sent out by different committees of the APA over the years. The other rationalization is that the patient consented to therapy. And that's like saying that someone who has a legal guardian can consent to financial transactions. It's simply impossible. Someone in therapy can't consent to an improper relationship with their therapist. And it's the therapist's job to guard that special nature of the therapy relationship.
Well, and that actually, that last one is fairly common. In fact, when I was getting ready for the show today, the woman who does my hair and makeup made that comment, which is, well, but if they're consenting adults, really what can be done about it legally? I mean, these are 2 adult people. So that's interesting that what has been found is that, in fact, at the time someone enters into treatment, they are entering with a level of vulnerability.
Exactly.
That does not allow them to actually have equal consent.
Specifically, the courts, I don't know which case, have held that the therapy relationship is like that of a ward to their guarantor or their guardian.
Okay.
And they simply cannot. The ability to consent to a sexual relationship is absent in these relationships. It's not informed consent.
Okay.
And the therapist, the opportunistic therapists, want to say this is informed consent. She's a free-functioning adult,
Sure.
ignoring that by its nature, therapy involves some level of regression. Now, different therapies pull for more or less regression, but there's always some compromise in the patient's ability to manage the relationship with the therapist.
Well, and the whole point is that the client is not there to manage the relationship with the therapist.
Exactly.
I mean,
It's
they're
not
there
her
to manage
job.
their other relationships.
That's right.
So, yeah, now you mentioned her job. Do you know statistically, or do you have any idea how many times the victims in this situation are women versus men?
It's a very high percentage of the total incidents. I can't think of a number.
Okay.
What I can think of is surveys that were done in the mid-'80s by the American Psychiatric Association, and that found that something like, of their members, of their reporting responding members, this is not all therapists, something like 6.9% of male therapists admitted to at least one involvement with a patient, and something like 3.1% admitted of female psychiatrists admitted to some involvement with patients. Now, there's two pieces there. One is that the females are reporting a higher incidence than was reported in the mid-'70s. Now, that may
Okay.
just be specific to psychiatrists. That doesn't cover psychologists, social workers, and marriage
Right.
and family therapists. The other piece is that those reports were of single incidents. All of the people in that survey who reported a second contact with a patient, sexual contact with a patient, were the male therapists. None of the women in that answered that survey reported more than one sexual involvement.
Okay, that's interesting.
Closely
what do you
related.
think that's? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, 80% of the therapists who cross the line do it again.
Okay, so there is a high recidivism.
Yes.
Now, you know, it reminds me actually of other sexual crimes in terms of, you know, that's reported. How often do the clients actually report their therapist when this happens?
I don't know. We don't know, say, if there's 100 women out there being seduced by their therapist. We don't know if the 3 that come forward or the 10 that come forward represent 100, or do they represent 150. So you don't know
Okay.
how extensive it is. But you can be certain that it's very rarely done, because it's a very difficult thing to press a complaint through the licensing board, through the professional associations, and then go the next step to a civil or a criminal prosecution. It's extremely difficult. It's very exhausting. And for the patient, often, this is a clinical judgment when they go into a later therapy. The question is, do you want to tie up the next 4 or 5 years of your life trying to get justice for this crime that was done to you? And that has to be done on a case-by-case basis. The second therapist who's helping the person deal with the original victimization has to put aside their own anger at their predecessor and not require the woman to prosecute a case if she just needs to get done with it and get away from it.
Now, is the second treating therapist required to report the offending therapist?
No. In fact, the report has to be made, if there's a report to be made, by the victim.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not like mandatory child abuse reporting, where we licensed professionals and others, school teachers, clergy, etc., have to report within 36 hours a reasonable suspicion of child abuse. It's not like that. In this case, we run against the rules of confidentiality. We can't make the report. The patient has to. Now, we can support them and back them up. And in fact, when I was on the ethics committee for our local chapter of CAMFAT, that was our position, is that we supported clients making reports when they felt they had been injured.
Okay. Ooh. Well, let's, you know, we had talked about how this process happens in terms of a series of boundary violations, because it's pretty uncommon for the first time a client to walk into the room, they're having sex with their therapist. I mean, I imagine this is something that unfolds with time. Okay.
Yes.
So let's take a look at some of the boundaries you had told me about earlier. You said one of the first things that's going to happen in the relationship is that there's going to be a rule change for this particular patient. Maybe then a special status, excessive self-referencing, meaning the therapist is eliciting from the patient how the patient feels about them, eroticizing the therapy, excessive physical contact, excessive personal contact, outside socializing, alcohol or drug use with the patient, and an implication or promise of subsequent relationship or marriage. And I have those in front of me, so it's a, if you didn't memorize them, neither did I.
Good.
Let's take a look at the first one you mentioned, which is rule changes. What do you mean by that?
Well, consider the whole dozen items that you just read as deviations representing a pattern of deviation, not a single episode. So there are certainly legitimate occasions where you might meet with a patient who's in a state of crisis at a coffee shop. But that would be a single episode. You wouldn't do therapy in a coffee shop. That's a bizarre thing to do.
Yes, it is.
So in terms of the first one, the rule changes would be things like meeting this patient on Saturday mornings when you don't normally see patients on Saturday mornings, or reducing this person's fee when you wouldn't ordinarily reduce someone else's fee, except that you're trying to put the makes on this client.
Okay.
Those would be examples of rule changes. Another one would be most therapists don't take calls at home. They prefer the calls to go through an answering service, and then the service will call them at home, and that's my case, and most of us, 24-hour availability as needed. A rule change in that area would be to give the patient your home phone and let them call you directly. That's a boundary breakage. It's a very unusual thing to do.
And so part of that, which will lead in the next one, the special status for the
Yes.
patient, then you would be giving the patient the message that somehow they are particularly important
They're
to
special
you.
and they're different. They're better than all the other clients, or more interesting than all the other clients.
Okay. And how is that a risk for the patient? Because, I mean, there might be people out there watching saying, well, wouldn't that enhance somebody's self-esteem, for example, to know that they were that important to their therapist?
Well, that's what the offending therapists say, that it does enhance their self-esteem. That's part of the rationalizations. But you have to bring that together with the profile of the people who are ordinarily victimized in this kind of behavior. And those are women who desperately need to feel special. They're women who have chronic self-esteem problems, body image problems, and most likely come from abusive households. Either they experienced incest in their early lives, or they had alcoholic parents, or psychotic parents, or an absent parent, things that set them up to have a very high need to feel special and to tolerate a lot of inappropriate behavior in order to get the specialness.
Yeah, it's almost like willing to pay the price, whatever it might be. We need to take a quick break.
Okay.
Stay tuned. When we return, we'll learn more about this power dynamic. Stay with us.